our second keynote. Yesterday evening, Jean-Yves, standing there, said, is there any need to introduce the first keynote? And I can really put also the question to Anna and to you. Is there any need to introduce Anna Triandafyllidou to you? Let me give it a try in my own way. And as I was complimenting Luc yesterday for the deeply interdisciplinary character of the project, and I can add today the very deeply interdisciplinary character of all the panels we have had here, I think you also have been choosing an interdisciplinary kind of panel for the two keynotes. Yesterday we were listening to Professor Hathaway, who is a lawyer, and Anna Triandafyllidou is political scientist, but in a prolific way that I think, for me, you're really unprecedented, Anna. But now I'm really looking forward to your presentation. Yesterday night, Professor Hathaway really reminded us, and I try to summarize in my own way, of the importance of the core of the protection. And he was speaking of the slippery slope. By investing so much in the vulnerability questions that we risk making the core again negotiable. So the core is not negotiable. I found it such an elevating way of reminding us of these basic legal instruments. And very, very kind of spontaneously, I thought of a very refreshing reaction of a student on the train in Belgium, I think about 15 years ago, what it was about, because you said everybody deserves the best possible treatment, and that is what we should do in migration. It was about a time that in Belgium, and I think the situation is still the case, on a Friday evening you have packed trains, the second class crowded, impossible, and first class people ignoring completely the situation, and everybody asking, can't you degrade the first class so that we can also step on this first class? And then the solution was, well, let's extend the second class. And a student said, no, abolish the second class and treat everybody as if a first class. And this was a refreshing insight, and I thought yesterday night. Now, I wonder how you will reply to this. Yesterday, we were really reminded of, let us really return to the core. And the question you raised tonight is, to me, exactly on the other side. Shall we look for a new status? But you put it with a question mark. So I'm very intrigued in the way that will be the way you will reply to your own question. But who is Anna Triandafyllidou? And I've been running after her 2 days long to say, what would you like me to say about you? Because I could say so many things. And now, 2 seconds ago, she gave me this little paper, and I said, I will not read it. I'll do it my own way. Now, the first time I saw you, Anna, you were for me fascinating. This was a round of evaluation of research projects funded by the European Research Council. And you were like a routine principal investigator. You could address all these questions. You were so professional. And that was the first moment I met you. And then you went to Florence, and then you were a tandem with Tarek Modoud. I knew Tarek Modoud very well. And you have been really working on these several issues that are linked with migration: citizenship, multiculturalism, secularism. And as I already said, you're so prolific. You embrace people, you take them on board. I mean, I can only really compliment you for the way you are, the researcher I know, and a fantastically enthusiastic scholar on crucial issues. And now comes what I need to read, because I did. Yes. After Florence, you went to Canada, and now she's the holder, the first, of the Research Excellence Fund to study migrant integration in the context of rapid socio-economic and technological transformation. So I'm so happy I ran after you. At least I could update you up to. And who knows, in 5 years you will be again a flourishing scholar in another country. But tonight we listen to you, Anna. Fantastic, Anna.
Well, thank you so much, Marie-Claire, for this very warm introduction, and thanks to Luc and everyone from the VULNER project. I've been really honored and actually also very stimulated by being a member of the advisory board of VULNER and having followed the different works. Actually, because of the pandemic, we have mostly met online rather than in person, but I was delighted to be able to come in person today in Brussels. As Marie-Claire actually said, since 2019, because I don't only study migration, I practice migration. So I've moved to Canada with my family to take up the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Migration and Integration at Toronto Metropolitan University. And on this, I want to add a special note that while I've been at this university, actually a year ago, our university was renamed. It used to be called Ryerson University, but Egerton Ryerson was one of the architects of the residential schools in Canada, the schools that have been kidnapping basically and abusing Indigenous children from their families. And this was a legacy that the university was grappling with already for 5 years, actually, before I joined, but after the discoveries of unmarked graves around residential schools in British Columbia and elsewhere, unfortunately, in Canada, it really became untenable. And I say this because this is also part of my academic and personal experience in being in Canada and studying migration and asylum from the other side of the Atlantic. And I often find myself, but on this occasion I didn't need it because my colleagues from Canada were here to do this translation, because I often find myself, whether in North America or in Europe, to kind of do this meaningful translation of what exactly we mean by different concepts and how are the policies developing in really very different ways. But I won't bother you anymore with this introduction. I'd like actually to use today to make a general reflection about migration and asylum today in Europe and more broadly. And that's why, yes, I have framed my title as a new, as a question: do we need a new status for people seeking protection in Europe, or may I say at least also in Europe and North America? And of course, as you can imagine, I'm not going to provide a definite answer, but it is a way to help us think. And I think one thing that I've been thinking for over 10 years now, and I think this project VULNER also reflects, is that it is very difficult really to distinguish between migrants and asylum seekers or refugees these days. And I'm really very, how can I say, convinced of that. I'm not sure if it is a good or a bad thing. It's probably neither good nor bad, but it is a fact. And I think actually that I also recall the time, maybe at least 15 years ago, when sociologists like me or political scientists would say, asylum is for the lawyers and we do migration. And then there came a time, and I think that was the end of the years 2000, 2007, 8, 9, that we started kind of converging, and then asylum became the issue of sociologists, and also migration became even more the issue of lawyers and international lawyers at that. And I've asked often myself also whether what we call the mixed motivations, and again, you probably remember we used to talk about mixed pathways, saying people travel with the same routes, perhaps use the same smuggler services, or are caught into trafficking networks similarly, regardless of whether they're moving because they're persecuted or because mainly of socioeconomic reasons. But I really ask myself, and I don't have a good answer, did mixed motivations emerge in the late 2000s, in early 2010s, or have they always been there, but there was something to do with the political context that didn't make them so visible? And I do believe, and that is very special, I think, for Europe in particular, that why in the 80s and the 90s we didn't, the question of asylum was quite different, is because asylum seekers were mainly those coming to Europe, but even globally, those coming, say, from Vietnam, were people who were fleeing mostly persecution from communist regimes. So it was nice to be, they were mostly welcome because they were the proof our system is working and their system is not working. So it was a complete, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of these bigger contexts within which today as well migration and asylum happens. And in that sense, I also feel that at the time, the local and the regional conflicts were very much interpreted within this Cold War actually duel that was happening in the world, and where Europe geographically was also very much caught in the middle. I was a teenager in the late 1980s where we were marching, everyone was marching in Europe against nuclear armaments. And I think today we have lost sight of this very important change. And I think today the way in which regional conflicts have a global dimension is quite different, and if you want, is more complex. So, of course, we see, the Ukraine actually reminds us, like the invasion of Russia into Ukraine reminds us of the Cold War, but the situation of Syria or Afghanistan and the way in which these are both local conflicts but also proxy wars shows us how can I say, complex are these dynamics. And I think that is the bigger context within which we need to understand and interpret what I will call not just mixed motivations, but actually complex motivations. Now, a second issue is important I would like to speak about is that we have used and perhaps even overused the word crisis and saying we are a crisis in the singular and in the plural, and how we govern this crisis. But one thing that I want to say is what we have been witnessing, again, in the last 10 years is a temporal evolution of those crises. So in the beginning, it's almost like everyone is motivated, everyone wants to help. And I had heard this expression in Greece, probably it's almost now 10 years ago, by some colleagues with whom I was collaborating in an NGO, and they said, this is the happy, actually they were talking about 2015, and they said 2015 or even 14 was the happy refugee moment in Greece, with so many people coming, Greek citizens traversing really a very painful socioeconomically moment in relation to the financial crisis in Greece, just felt empowered they could do something for people who were in a much worse situation than they were. But of course, this was predicated on the idea that this nearly 1 million people that went through Turkey, Greece, and moved north were not staying. Once they started staying, that became a different challenge, and that was the unwelcome refugee. And I think we have seen this in many places, and I know this is a question mark even today with Ukrainians. It is spectacular and admirable that there is a significant number of people from the Ukraine seeking temporary protection in Europe and elsewhere, and that so far this seems to work. Actually, it makes us think that it could have worked also for Syrians and others. When you can create one-stop shops for Ukrainians, you could create them also for others, but it also begs the question of this temporality. And I think the temporality is important, both in relation to how support for asylum seekers or people, seeking protection with really complex motivations are treated, but it also is important in the way we govern the crisis. Yes. And so in speaking about how we govern the crisis, what we notice is, as after the first, surprise when a situation erupts and people flee, or even when a protracted situation, keeps generating mixed flows of people, one thing that we notice is in this kind of crisis governance, as we have called it with my colleague Zeynep Sahin-Mensutek, is that there is a proliferation and a fragmentation of rules. So rules keeps changing. There is a lot of different levels of rules. There are national rules. There are, for instance, regional in the sense European rules. There's international rules, and there is even local rules that cities try to implement. Of course, each of these level or layer of rules may have different jurisprudence, different jurisdictional validity, and may even not be valid in some cases, but it is implemented, and it creates a high level of uncertainty and fragmentation. It also fosters informality, and we used to know informality, so like migrants work informally without a contract, or people have, informal or irregular status or engage into informal economic activities, we never knew that the government could do informal things to govern migration and asylum and actually govern this complex process that I was talking about. So that oftentimes things that happen, and I think things that were documented in the VULNER project, also in relation to the day-to-day work of the social workers that are in camps, or the lawyers that seek to help people who have been, particularly those who have been classified as vulnerable, often encounter this informality. And actually with Zeynep, we have focused this notion of informality as a way to explain or make sense of what happens with people that find themselves in these protracted situations of reception/detention, or who are pushed back and forth between borders, whether in Dublin returns or actually returns from the EU to a country outside the EU. And we actually saw that informality also borders illegality when you do illegal pushbacks, like my own country of origin right now is doing illegal pushbacks, particularly at the land border. So you push these people who probably experience complex or multiple vulnerabilities, you push them back, or actually you impose them to cross a border. And this is, of course, when you execute an expulsion, oftentimes through the legal procedure, sometimes without satisfying the legal procedure. And also we have spoken about informality when you incentivize returns. And I think, again, today we heard a lot of these types of incentivization. So when you make the life impossible for people who seek protection, or also for migrants, because you deprive them from access to basic rights, because you put them in situations of accommodation that are inhumane, and then at some point we have seen that people say, at this point I'd rather go back rather than stay here. Or they try to actually move forward because, and I think somebody was talking about it yesterday, where people disappear from the system precisely because, no, it was this morning about the minors. So when people disappear from the system because they know they're going to turn 18 and things will happen, they will be invited to leave. So I think these are two new elements. One is this, as I said, the fragmentation and temporal dimension, constant changing of the framework, and the other is the fact that governance is becoming increasingly informal and not just formal and, as I say, following the law as it should be. Another element that I think is new in the current context is that migration has been elevated at the level of a high-profile diplomatic issue. Again, I think it was 15 or 20 years ago, international relations had nothing to do with migration. Diplomats didn't think migration was an issue or asylum that they wanted to take care of. It was really very, as we say in Italian, terra terra. It wasn't something they wanted to deal with. And on the contrary, right now we see that migration and the management, the governance of migration, and I would say / asylum or temporary protection has become really a matter of state. And it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that there is a migration diplomacy going on. We've seen that migration actually is used by countries of destination, but also by the EU to negotiate a number of other measures and elements and policies with countries of origin and transit. And I think we have seen that migration is becoming, we have seen that there is a proliferation of border regimes, and I'm thinking there both the border regimes that are instituted, like the border regime in the Greek asylum law, which says that when you are caught within the border, there's specific and actually less good procedures and how can I say, possibilities, for instance, of appeal that apply to you. But I'm thinking here of the border regimes that are not just physical and territorial, but that are also legal and virtual or digital, because they can catch you wherever you are. And they can push you from one status to another. And speaking of the externalization of these both territorial and digital borders, I think we need to see how migration then at that point becomes weaponized, and becomes weaponized not just by countries like, say, Turkey or Libya in the past, or maybe even Morocco, but it becomes weaponized actually by the EU itself, because it is used as a very important tool for pressurizing other countries. And I think we might, I think it would be important actually to remember that this is the wrong approach for both migration and asylum, because this really disregards the realities of both people and the communities where they live in, whether temporarily or for a longer time. A last point that I want to make, which comes again from a research that we've been doing for a couple of years with two other colleagues, Katie Kushminder and Caterina Guidi, which was, I don't dare go into the details because there are colleagues here from Italy that are much more of an expert than I am, but and I think you've probably mentioned it yesterday, but our work in considering migrants in transit was inspired by the humanitarian status protection that exists in Italy, where we have seen a practice from Italian judges and lawyers and civil society to give humanitarian status to people who were initially refused, their application for asylum was refused. And I think this is very interesting, not just from a legal perspective, but also from a sociological and governance perspective, because the question arises for me, if someone leaves their country mainly for economic reasons, so they're not truly, they probably don't qualify for asylum, they didn't leave for reasons of persecution or civil war or intense violence, but then they go through a situation like Libya. In the study that we did, it was Libya, but I can think also of the Darien Straits in Panama right now, and people from South America trying to go north. So the situation they suffer there is such that they become so traumatized that they should actually be given protection. They're no longer a migrant in the way we understand the word migrant. They're not an asylum seeker in terms of what happened in their own country of origin, but they are people who need protection. And maybe in that case, I would use the word vulnerability. There are people with compounded and complex vulnerabilities because of what happened to them in transit. And I think what is very interesting and very encouraging is what has been happening in Italy. And although the policy has changed in the last 3 years 3 times, it's been to acknowledge, A, that these people suffered extreme hardship while they were in transit, and B, that these people pay particular attention to the efforts of these people to integrate at destination in Italy. And I think, again, yesterday, one of the speakers was saying, actually, this idea of trying, you try to integrate in Italy, learn Italian, then you, I don't know, go to Belgium, try to learn French in Belgium, then if they send you back to Italy, try to learn Italian. But still, I think the fact that people create a life in that country, or try to create a life, can be an important and innovative element for providing status, humanitarian status, to these people, precisely arguing that the hardship that would be inflicted on them if they were returned to their country of origin would be disproportionate compared to, if you want, the threat or that they pose in the country of destination, or if you want the law that they violated by staying without appropriate documentation. And I think this is all the more important because, to my mind, it actually points to the very complex situation that, in my view, characterizes migration and asylum today, where they are not two separate situations, but they are not even a continuum. I would say they are a galaxy of different combinations, and I'm not sure, in this galaxy where the color is more towards asylum or the color is more towards migration, where asylum understood as having mostly reasons for seeking protection, where migration is having mostly socioeconomic motivations for moving. And precisely the question that arises to me is, what kind of protection can we provide to people who are in these more complex situations? And for instance, to the best of my knowledge, although I'm not a lawyer, there is not an explicit provision for such situations. And I'm thinking also of the humanitarian and compassionate permit that we have in Canada. This certainly, like in Italy, would possibly cover those situations, only that in Canada these are not, at least so far, very common, because usually the humanitarian compassionate status are mostly precisely for people who have lived in Canada for one reason or another, lost their status, didn't get status, found themselves in a difficult situation. But there is no significant, or at least by European standards, no significant influx of people who enter the territorial border and seek protection or stay undocumented. And concluding my talk, so I've been asking myself what kind of a new status is needed. And on this, I totally hear you, James, that I'm mindful that we shouldn't actually degrade the protection that is provided to asylum seekers and to refugees. How did you say, the first and the second class? Yeah, I'm not, of course, ideally you abolish the second class and treat everyone as first class. But if that is not realistically possible, what do we do? Of course, we should strive that we provide first-class protection to everyone. But also, I'm mindful that we shouldn't dilute the status and protection provided to people who are personally persecuted and who qualify whatever the Geneva Convention definition. But in my view, at the same time, the Geneva Convention is probably out of date at this stage, or again, I'm not sure if it is the situation that has changed or it is the way we look at the situation that has changed. Because I believe people had always moved for both humanitarian and socioeconomic reasons. So I think in terms of analytical but also perhaps practical implications, the idea is that we should, I think, acknowledge that motivations are complex. They're not just mixed, they're complex, and in that same way, pathways are complex. And what I mean by this is that the same person can move between different statuses and also can change their decision on the way as to what they will try and how they will navigate the policy options available to them. And this happens, as I said before, in an environment that is itself moving. So the options that are available to you, for instance, if you applied for asylum and then you're put in a reception center obligatorily in Germany and then you stay for 24 months there, maybe the options that are available to you towards the end of that stay are different than those that they were when you started. And the other element that I think I want to say is that we need to recognize that people are not passive recipients of policy, they do something with policies. And often what they do is under, of course, very partial information and very incomplete information. So in that sense, obviously, they're not computers. They don't make a cost-benefit analysis, as sometimes governments assume, but they do make decisions, and they do try to get to the best possible outcome for themselves. And in that sense, I think there is a little bit of a contradiction in the notion of vulnerability, because the people who are vulnerable, who make it to apply for asylum, who make it to the shores of Italy or Greece, or who make it to some airport, are the most resilient, actually. And they are the people who survived and made it, or the people who had the energy to try and take those risks. And probably, as I think has been discussed also yesterday and today, they wouldn't understand themselves as vulnerable, although by our own, both individual and collective, situational definitions, they are vulnerable. And I wonder whether in reconciling migration and asylum, the best way is to focus on human dignity and on how to make sure, and again, I think it was discussed also yesterday in relation to accommodation and, reception/detention. It was discussed in relation to minors this morning, that we need to make sure that people's human dignity is respected, no matter in which procedure they are in. And in that sense, for me, vulnerability and the way I have seen it evolving during these 4 years, actually, of the VULNER project, and again, I also remember when we met, Marie-Claire and I met you and Luc more than 5 years ago at a conference in Paris, is that vulnerability is a tool. It's not about the principles or the legal instruments of protection, but it is a good tool that could guide us to protecting human dignity for everyone. And with this, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I realize we're almost getting to the close.
So, thank you very much, Anna, for the talk. I think it was also very complementary with what we heard yesterday. I'm just here to take questions from the audience that could be addressed to you. If that's okay with you? So we keep you on stage a bit.
Of course.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I also think that Marie-Claire has other obligations.
Everyone is
so
like,
thank you very
okay,
much
get
for
us to
having
the
been here.
last panel.
No.
And I have to thank Luke, because I said no one will stay until the end of the day, and he said no, I'll have another panel after you, so people will have to stay.
Yes, James.
Thank you, Anna, for the talk, and I'm of course happy to see that you're pitching the new status as a parallel status rather than a replacement, which I think is very wise. Could you say a little bit more about this new status that you've described? As I understand you, people who left their country of origin with no underlying risk of persecution, no civil war, none of the hallmarks of current protection, they would be perhaps classic economic migrants, but who endure extreme hardship en route, including perhaps psychological trauma that's ongoing. You would see them as the beneficiaries of this new parallel status, if I've understood correctly. So might you say a word, since you emphasized that we needed to be pragmatic in terms of what we would pitch as a response to vulnerability, particularly keeping in mind some of the comments from Saskia Bricmont yesterday afternoon that I must say are still sort of traumatizing me as I listen to her describe her efforts. Why is it that you believe that any government would have any interest in that status, and how would you find a way to make it real?
Yeah, why would we convince the government? Yeah, that's a tall order. No, I can give a couple of examples. For instance, in Italy, the case would be someone who is a middle-class young person from Ghana, leaves Ghana, goes through Libya on his way to Italy or somewhere else, perhaps not fully aware of what is happening in Libya, is kidnapped by one of the tribal, actually, smuggling networks, is abused, is tortured for extortion usually, is really severely beaten and abused. At some point, either his family pays, or the smugglers are convinced that the family won't pay. He may be forced to work for some time for them, and then makes it to the shore, boards the dinghy, arrives in Italy. The person applies for asylum, but the situation in Ghana is not such. He is not, does not tick the boxes. Of course, that takes about 1.5 years or 2 years to receive the rejection. The person, in the meantime, actually, when we noticed this practice emerging, people were in the SPRAR, what was called the SPRAR centers, which were pretty good centers in terms of providing some support, accommodation, learn the language, see what you do with your life, and try to get you into some employment. And then asylum is refused, and then the person, with the help of some NGO, is applying for humanitarian status. And what emerged through the practice of the judges and also a decision of the Court of Cassation was that if the person could prove, actually, if the person went to court and spoke Italian and could even show that he or she had friends in Italy, had some part-time job, because also being in accommodation, you shouldn't have a full-time, relatively well-paid job, I'm having a life. And in the meantime, some more time has passed, And then also the person can document that they've been really through very special abuse or things that have happened to them for which they would be completely, how can I say, ashamed and marginalized to go back to their country. And the court says, as I was saying, you know, yes, we give you humanitarian status, which in Italy for my Canadian colleagues is a temporary status, but that then bridges you to the long-term status. So then you convert this to, you know, status for work, or so for employment or for studies, and at least you get a chance to become regular. Now, if I think also of the case, for instance, of Canada, yeah, and the famous Roxham Road, again, for those who don't know, which is a small provincial road that used to be the main entry point from upstate New York to Quebec and to Canada. And until March 2023, Canada and the United States had the Safe Third Country Agreement that was implemented only in the formal border crossing points, and Roxham Road was not one of those, although it was not a terrible forest, you know, that people could walk. And again, to give a sense of the numbers, there were 39,000 people who crossed from the US to Canada in 2022 through this road, but that was in Canada considered a crisis. And it was a crisis because it was not controlled. Anyhow, so within these flows, we can have someone who took, I don't know, a tourist visa to the United States and then is is entering Canada, trying to seek asylum. But we can have also someone who has made their way on foot from South America through, you know, the Darien jungle and through very difficult situations. Or, for instance, someone who comes from Nigeria and goes through that route, and we know there's people who go through that, and arrives at Canada really what we call broken. And the question arises for me, so should I just see that this person was not an asylum seeker in the first place, or in their country there is a situation that is, you know, maybe not very good, but is not a situation that would make them a refugee? Or do we take into account what happened and the things that have happened in these people's lives in the meantime? And mind you, Canada, unfortunately, as well, is facing now quite a significant backlog and delay in processing asylum applications. So this is the very basic thinking that had inspired us. We had made some, in 2 papers, we have made some arguments. One is that, for instance, torture and extortion are recognized as crimes against humanity. And in such a situation, we should recognize, for instance, that a place like Libya was a place completely out of law because there's no law, there's no government, there's no protection. It's not even a space of exception. And these people could not afford any kind of protection and have been through these very traumatic situations. Also, in another case, I think it is important to put the accent on the efforts of the person to find their place in the society of arrival, which might not even have been the place where they were planning to go in the first place, but once they stayed there, they created a life. Now, so this is, and I think we really need to do some more thinking, because in a second paper that is now under review, we were trying, to make the case that there could be a humanitarian status at the EU level that would actually homogenize these different possibilities that may exist in different countries, where, however, again, to the best of our knowledge, the humanitarian status practice, the way it has evolved in Italy, is probably the best, the most promising so far. Now, the question, why would the state do that? I think then I will reply in a Canadian way. It's about the society we want to be. And one thing I really love about Canada is that although things are not perfect, certainly not, but there is a discourse on values that persists rather than a discourse, unfortunately, I'm afraid in Europe we've lost the discourse on values. It's all about the costs, but it's about what kind of society we want to be. And in that sense, yes, if you receive someone who, I don't know, we want to call it needs protection or is vulnerable or both of these things, and you want to make it right for them, that would be my plea to a government.